So today, on reading number 8, I think, we rejoin Bod, or Nobody Owens, as he's been tempted away from the graveyard and through a ghoul gate by a series of ghouls who are taking him into the ghoul kingdom, and he is starting to regret his choice. He's being snuck away by 3 ghouls called the Duke of Westminster, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, and the Honourable Archibald Fitzhugh. I fancy those aren't their real names. And they have just been joined by 2 more ghouls who are going to be the Emperor of China and the 33rd President of the United States. They are climbing down a huge wall of graves into the ghoul kingdom. The Duke of Westminster gave a guttural squawk and pretended to be scared, and Bod and the 3 of them swung down the wall of graves with the 2 new creatures in pursuit. That's 2 more ghouls. None of them seemed to get tired or out of breath. Under that red sky, with the burnt-out sun gazing down at them like a dead eye, but yet eventually he fetched upon the side of a huge statue of a creature whose whole face seemed to have become a fungoid growth, like a mushroom. Bod found himself being introduced to the 33rd President of the United States and the Emperor of China. "This is Master Bod," said the Bishop of Bath and Wells. "He's going to become one of us." "He's in search of a good meal," said the Honourable Archibald Fitzhugh. "Well, you're guaranteed fine dining when you become one of us, young lad," said the Emperor of China. "Yup," said the 33rd President of the United States. Bod said, "I become one of you? You mean I'll turn into you?" "Smart as a whip, sharp as a tack. You'd have to get up pretty late at the night to put anything past this lad," said the Bishop of Bath and Wells. "Indeed, one of us. As strong, as fast, as unconquerable. Teeth so strong they can crush any bones, and tongue sharp and long enough to lick the marrow from the deepest marrow bone, or flay," that means whip off, "the flesh from a fat man's face," said the Emperor of China. "Able to slip from shadow to shadow, never seen, never suspected. Free as air, fast as thought, cold as frost, hard as nails, dangerous as us," said the Duke of Westminster. Bod looked at the creatures. "But what if I don't want to be one of you?" he said. "Don't want to? Of course you want to. What could be finer? I don't think there's a soul in the universe doesn't want to be just like us. We got the best city. Ghoulheim," said the 33rd President of the United States. "The best life, the best food. Can you imagine," interrupted the Bishop of Bath and Wells, "how fine a drink the black ichor that collects in a leaden coffee can be? Or how it feels to be more important than kings and queens, than presidents or prime ministers, or heroes, to be sure of it, in the same way that people are more important than Brussels sprouts." Bod said, "What are you people?" "Ghouls," said the Bishop of Bath and Wells. "Bless me, somebody wasn't paying attention, was he? We're ghouls. Look." Below them, a whole troop of the little creatures were bouncing and running and leaping, heading for the path below them, and before he could say another word, he was snatched up by a pair of bony hands and was flying through the air in a series of jumps and lurches as the creatures headed down to meet the others of their kind. The wall of graves was ending, and now there was a road, and nothing but a road, a much-trodden path across a barren plain, a desert of rocks and bones that wound towards the city, high on a huge red rock hill many miles away. Bod looked up at the city and was horrified. An emotion engulfed him. It goes over him like a big wave. That mingled repulsion and fear, disgust and loathing, all tinged with shock. Ghouls do not build. They are parasites and scavengers, eaters of carrion, that's dead meat. The city they call Ghoulheim is something they found long ago but did not make. No one knows, if any human ever knew, what kind of creatures it was that made those buildings, who honeycombed the rocks with tunnels and towers, but it is certain that no one but the ghoul folk could have wanted to stay there, or even to approach that place. Even from the path below Ghoulheim, even from miles away, Bod could see that all the angles were wrong, that the walls sloped crazily, that it was every nightmare he had ever endured and made into a place, like a huge mouth of jutting teeth. It was a city that had been built just to be abandoned, in which all the fears and madnesses and revulsions of the creatures who built it were made into stone. The ghoul folk had found it and delighted in it, and called it home. Ghouls moved fast. They swarmed along the path through the desert more swiftly than a vulture flies, and Bod was carried along by them, held high overhead by a pair of strong ghoul arms, tossed from one to another, feeling sick, feeling dread and dismay, feeling stupid. Above them, in the sour red skies, things were circling on huge black wings. "Careful," said the Duke of Westminster. "Tuck him away. Don't want those night gaunts stealing him. Bloody stealers." "Yeah, we hate stealers," shouted the Emperor of China. "Night gaunts in the red sky above Gulchelm." Bod took a deep breath and shouted, just as Miss Lupescu had taught him. He made a call like an eagle's cry in the back of his throat. One of the winged beasts dropped towards him, circled lower, and Bod made the call again until it was stifled by hard hands clamping over his mouth. "Good idea calling him down," said the Honourable Archibald Fitzhugh, "but trust me, they aren't edible until they've been rotting for at least a couple of weeks, and they just causes trouble. No love lost between our sides and theirs, eh?" His teacher, Miss Lupescu, taught him how to make the call of a night... what are they called? Night gaunt, sorry. The night gaunt rose again into the dry desert air to rejoin its fellows, and Bod felt all hope vanish. The ghoul sped on towards the City of the Rocks, and Bod, now flung unceremoniously over the stinking shoulders of the Duke of Westminster, was carried with them. The dead sun set, and 2 moons rose, one huge and pitted and white, which seemed as it rose to be taking up half the horizon, although it shrank as it went up, and a smaller moon, the bluish-green colour of the veins of mould in a cheese, and the arrival of this moon was an occasion of celebration for the ghoul folk. They stopped marching and made a camp beside the road. One of the new members of the band, Bod thought it might have been the one who'd been introduced as the famous writer Victor Hugo, who wrote Les Miserables, produced a sack which turned out to be full of firewood, several pieces still with the hinges or brass handles attached, along with a metal cigarette lighter, and soon made a fire, around which all the ghoul folk sat and rested. They stared up at the greenish-blue moon and scuffled for the best places by the fire, insulting each other, sometimes clawing or biting. "We'll sleep soon and we'll set off for Gulheim at moonset," said the Duke of Westminster. "It's just another 9 or 10 hours run along the way. We should reach it by next moonrise. Then we'll have a party, eh? Celebrate your being made into one of us." "It doesn't hurt," said the Honourable Archibald Fitzhugh. "Not so you'd notice. And after, think how happy you'll be." They all started telling stories then of how fine and wonderful a thing it was to be a ghoul, of all the things they had crunched up and swallowed down with their powerful teeth. Impervious they were, means they couldn't be hurt by, to disease or illness, said one of them. Why, it didn't matter what their dinner had died of, they could just chomp it down. They told of the places they had been, which mostly seemed to be catacombs, like tombs, and plague pits. "Plague pits is good eating," said the Emperor of China, and everyone agreed. They told Bod how they had got their names and how he, in his turn, once he had become a nameless ghoul, would be named, as they had been, after the main course of their first dinner. That's why they got those posh names. But I don't want to become one of you," said Bod. "One way or another," said the Bishop of Bath and Wells cheerily, "you'll become one of us. The other way is messier, involves being digested, and you're not really around very long to enjoy it." "But that's not a good thing to talk about," said the Emperor of China. "Best to be a ghoul. We're afraid of nothing." And all the ghouls around the coffin wood fire howled at this statement, and growled, and sang, and exclaimed at how wise they were, and how mighty, and how fine it was to be scared of nothing. There was a noise then, from the desert, from far away, a distant howl, and the ghouls gibbered and they huddled closer to the flames. Oh, they are scared. "What was that?" asked Bod. The ghouls shook their head. "Just something out there in the desert," whispered one of them. "Quiet, he'll hear us." And all the ghouls were quiet for a bit until they forgot about the thing in the desert, and began to sing ghoul songs filled with foul words and worse sentiments, the most popular of which were simply lists of which rotting body parts were to be eaten, and in which order. "I want to go home," said Bod, when the last of the bits in the song had been consumed. "I don't want to be here." "Don't take on so," said the Duke of Westminster. "Why, you little coot, I promise you that as soon as you're one of us, you'll not even remember as you ever there. I promise you that as soon as you're one of us, you'll not ever remember as you even had a name. I don't remember anything about the days before I was a ghoul, said the famous writer Victor Hugo. Nor do I, said the Emperor of China proudly. No, said the 33rd President of the United States. You'll be one of a select band of the cleverest, strongest, bravest creatures ever, bragged the Bishop of Bath and Wells. Bod was impressed by the ghouls' bravery, Bod was unimpressed by the ghouls' bravery or their wisdom. They were strong, though, and inhumanely fast, and he was at the centre of a troop of them. Making a break for it would have been impossible. They'd be able to catch up with him before he could even cover a dozen yards. Far off in the night, something howled once more, and the ghouls moved closer to the fire. Bod could hear them sniffing and cursing. He closed his eyes, miserable and homesick. He did not want to become one of the ghouls. He wondered how he'd ever been asleep when he was this worried and hopeless, and then, almost to his surprise, for 2 or 3 hours, he slept. A noise woke him. Upset, loud, close. It was someone saying, "Well, where is they, eh?" He opened his eyes to see the Bishop of Bath and Wells shouting at the Emperor of China. It seemed that a couple of the members of their group had disappeared in the night, just vanished, and no one had an explanation. The rest of the ghouls were on edge. They packed up their camp quickly, and the 33rd President of the United States picked Bod up and bundled him over his shoulder. The ghouls scrambled quickly back down the cliffs to the road, beneath a sky the colour of bad blood, and they hurried towards Goulet. They seemed significantly less exuberant or kind of happy and excited this morning. Now they seemed, at least to Bod, as he was bounced along, to be running away from something. Around midday, with the dead-eyed sun high overhead, the ghouls stopped and huddled. Ahead of them, high in the sky, circling on the hot air currents, were the night gaunts, dozens of them riding the thermals or the hot currents of air. The ghouls divided into 2 factions or groups. There were those who felt that the vanishing of their friends was meaningless, and those who believed that something, probably the night gaunts, was out to get them. They came to no agreement, except for a general agreement to arm themselves with rocks to throw at the night gaunts should they descend, and they filled the pockets of their suits and robes with pebbles from the desert floor. Something howled off in the desert to their left, and the ghouls eyed each other. It was louder than the night before, and closer, a deep, wolfish howl. "Did you hear that?" asked the Lord Mayor of London. "Nope," said the 33rd President of the United States. "Me neither," said the Honourable Archibald Fitzhugh. The howl came again. "We got to get home," said the Duke of Westminster, hefting a larger stone. The nightmare city of Gilcham sat on a high rocky outcrop ahead of them, and the creatures loped down the road towards it. "Night gaunts, come in!" shouted the Bishop of Bath and Wells. "Throw stones at the bleeders!" Bod's view of things was upside down at this point, bouncing up and down on the back of the 33rd President of the United States. Gritty sound from the path blown up into his face. But he heard cries, like eagle cries, and once again Bod called for help in night gaunt. No one tried to stop him this time, but he was not sure that anyone could have heard him over the cries of the night gaunts or the oaths and curses of the ghoul folk as they pitched and flung their stones into the air. Bod heard the howling again. Now it came from their right. "There's dozens of the blooming blinkers," said the Duke of Westminster gloomily. The 33rd President of the United States handed Bod over to the famous writer Victor Hugo, who threw the boy into his sack and put it over his shoulder. Bod was just glad the sack smelled of nothing worse than dusty wood. "They're retreating," shouted the ghoul. "Look at them go." "Don't you worry," said a voice that sounded to Bod like the Bishop of Bath and Wells near the sack. "There won't be any of this nonsense when we get to you to Gilheim. It's impenetrable, is Gilheim." Bod could not tell if any of the ghouls had been killed or injured fighting the night gaunts. He suspected from the imprecations of the Bishop of Bath and Wells that several more of the ghouls might have run off. "Quickly!" shouted someone who was probably the Duke of Westminster, and the ghouls set off at a run. Bod in the sack was uncomfortable, being painfully slammed against the famous writer Victor Hugo's back and occasionally banged on the ground. To make his time in the sack even more uncomfortable, there were still several lumps of wood, not to mention sharp screws and nails, in there with him, the final remnants of the coffin-based firewood. A screw was just underneath his hand, digging into him. Despite being jogged and jounced, jolted and jarred with every one of his captor's steps, Bod managed to grasp the screw in his right hand. He felt the tip of it, sharp to the touch. He hoped deep inside. Then he pushed the screw into the fabric of the sacks behind him, working the sharp end in and putting it back and making another hole a little way below the first. From behind he could hear something howl once more, and it occurred to him that anything that could terrify the ghoul folk must itself be even more terrifying than he could imagine, and for a moment he stopped stabbing with the screw. What if he fell from the sack into the jaws of some evil beast? But at least if he died, thought Bod, he would have died as himself, with all his memories, knowing who his parents were, who Silas was, even who Miss Lupescu was. That was good. He attacked the sack with a brass screw again, jabbing and pushing until he made another hole in the fabric. And that's where we'll leave it tonight.